Welcome to the ONS Energy Talks. My name is Anne Ekan, and it's my pleasure to host today's talk. How will the pandemic affect the 2020 November US elections? US has been hard hit by the COVID, putting additional focus and pressure on the authorities and the US president. On the energy front, the US has played a role as an OPEC plus country, assisting in dialing back on supply up against a massive demand destruction, causing oil prices to tank. Additionally, the Black Lives Matters protests have added to the spotlight on the US administration. What outcome currently looks the most likely when it comes to the 2020 presidential elections in November? And who better to ask than Mark P. Jones at the Baker Institute. Mark P. Jones is the fellow in political science at the Baker Institute, the Joseph D. Jamail Chair in Latin American Studies, and a professor in the Department of Political Science at Rice University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mark. It's a true pleasure to have you.
No, thank you. It's great to be here with y'all.
Great. And you're based in Houston, and from some recent reports, the numbers for COVID, they don't look so good. It looks like they're still on the rise. How are you doing, and can you tell us a bit about the current situation there?
Well, I'm fine. My family's fine, knock wood. But unfortunately, here in Houston, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in the number of infections. Fortunately, we've stayed away from deaths. That is, in terms of actual fatalities as a result of COVID, we're still at about 8 per 100,000, which is nowhere close to the 150 per 100,000 that we see in the New York metro area. But we do see more and more people getting sick. And that's a consequence of, one, we never really closed down the way they did in some other states. And then we've opened up pretty rapidly. And that combined with the Memorial Day holiday, plus many of the Black Lives Matters and George Floyd murder protests, have all contributed to a spread of the disease. And so we're starting to see a real uptick in infections. And it's not clear if that's going to stop or if we're going to hit a plateau.
So you also told when we talked a bit before the interview that a lot of sectors, obviously, it looks like it will be, lasting for some time. So a lot of sectors are trying to predict what the consequences are, I guess, in this situation.
Right. We're doing a lot of work with the hobby school over at the University of Houston, where I'm a research fellow, looking at different industries: oil and gas, restaurant, hospitality, hair salons, realtors, to see how they're managing. And what we're finding is these are companies that they aren't doing well. And if there's a second lockdown as a result of a resurgence of COVID, that could destroy many businesses that right now are on really just treading water.
Right. And looking at one of your recent studies, when you spoke to representatives for the oil and gas industry, right. They say they're pretty optimistic about the future, but at the same time, we see that 100,000 jobs have been lost, in 3 months. How do you reconcile those?
Well, I think when we did the survey of the Texas Oil and Gas Association, whose members produce about 80% of oil and natural gas in Texas, so they're pretty the major players. We did that survey back in May. That was the nadir, I think, for the industry. And so I think that while things aren't looking great, they aren't looking as bad as May, where some of the spot contracts were trading at negative value. So I think the idea is that things are looking better in that they're seeing $30 or $40 WTI and Brent in the future. But that's at the same time, they're thinking in terms of the health of their company, not sort of the overall industry. So I think for their companies, they're thinking things will be better than they are now, but that's in part because things couldn't get much worse.
So we're going to talk a bit about the elections as part of this conversation. And the same group in the same survey, they expressed some concern if Biden were to win the election. Why is he considered kind of a danger to the oil and gas industry?
Well, I think Joe Biden by himself might not be that much of a danger, but the Democratic Party is veering pretty sharply to the left on a variety of issues, and no more such than on the environment. And I think there's a tremendous fear in the oil and natural gas industry that if Biden gets to office, he's going to have to cut deals with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And he's going to have to throw them some bones and make some compromises on some of their policy priorities. And since he's going to probably hold fast on some things as they relate to Wall Street and hedge funds, he's going to have to give in. And one area where he may very well give in is allowing them to really push forward quickly with the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal, especially as it's been conceptualized by some left-wing elements within the Democratic Party, would be the death knell for the traditional oil and gas industry. Now, it wouldn't destroy it completely, but it would really undercut its ability to look towards the future and grow. And for many independents, it really could be the end of the industry. I think some of the super majors could adapt relatively well, but the rest of the industry would be in very dire straits. For instance, if you ended shale or essentially severely restricted shale drilling, that would have a devastating impact on the Texas economy, both across the state, but especially here in Houston and then out in West Texas where the Permian is, or down in the South Texas where the Eagle Ford is.
Sounds like the industry is following the elections very closely.
Yeah.
So.
They are, and they're nervous. And then I think that's where you're also seeing a view in the industry, in that in the past, in these situations, you would have often seen the industry try to essentially have it both ways. That is, support both candidates with the end goal that when whoever gets into office, you have a relationship with. I think there's a view in the oil and natural gas industry that if Joe Biden wins, it doesn't really matter if you're on good terms with him personally or some of people tied to him. The left wing of the Democratic Party that supports the Green New Deal is going to have their way on that issue. And so you're better off putting all of your essentially chips behind Donald Trump and hoping for the best.
So then I just have to get straight to the question that although a lot of things can happen until November and a lot of things will, what's your best bet today? Do you think that Trump will win the November presidential election?
No, I mean, I think the smart money would be on Joe Biden winning the presidential election. You have to remember, Donald Trump only narrowly defeated Hillary Clinton by a total of about 75,000 votes spread across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And that was after Clinton very incompetently didn't campaign in Wisconsin and only barely campaigned in Michigan. This time around, Trump would have to re-win those states, and things don't look good for him at all in Michigan today, nor in Wisconsin, as well as retain states that he won back in 2016 that now look much more doubtful, with, I think, Arizona and Florida being sort of two that pop up to mind, but North Carolina also is there. So, I wouldn't want to count Donald Trump out, but unless we start to see a strong rebound in the economy sometime in October, September, October, as well as Joe Biden commit some missteps on the campaign trail, things are not looking good for Donald Trump. One advantage that Trump might have, though, is that he is good at spinning the media to his advantage. And to the extent to which many of the George Floyd protests start to lead to the more left-wing elements within the Democratic Party having more visibility and more influence, such as those groups that want to defund or get rid of the police, those who are toppling statues of both Confederate generals, but also people who had nothing to do with the Confederacy across the country. The more that occurs, the more it helps Trump in that it alienates more centrist voters.
So has your predictions in this regard, has it changed with COVID or?
Yeah. Oh, no, I think Trump was always going to be the underdog in this election, but Trump's odds have gotten worse since the start of COVID-19, in part because one of the things that Trump was going to be banking on was that despite his very unpresidential behavior, in spite of many of the sort of unethical things that people believe he's done, the economy was doing pretty well. And many people are pocketbook voters in terms of they vote based on economic factors. And so up until COVID-19, it looked like Trump was going to, at the minimum, be able to say, okay, things are better off now, or at least the economy is rolling on well. Now, of course, we're in a recession. And when people essentially go to vote in October and November, if they compare their situation to a year ago, it's almost across the board going to be worse. The only thing Trump can hope for is at least that there's a start of an uptick in economic recovery. So if people are comparing where they are in October, November to April or May, they may say it's better.
Very interesting. So In a scenario where the Democrats win and Biden gets elected president, do you think U.S. will rejoin? I'm going to ask you two questions on that, actually. Do you think U.S. may rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement? And what about the possibilities of seeing CO2 taxes in the U.S.?
I think it's almost a certainty that if Biden wins, we'll rejoin the Paris Accord. That was something that Trump did very unilaterally, and even in many Republican circles, there was some opposition to it. CO2 taxes, I think a lot will depend there on what happens with the U.S. Senate. Right now, the Republicans have a 3-seat majority in the U.S. Senate. If Democrats are able to take control of the Senate and perhaps give themselves a 1 or 2 seat cushion, then I could see a CO2 tax having some potential. But if the Democrats don't take control of the Senate, it's probably out of the question. And even if they do take control of it, if they depend on people like, say, Joe Manchin, the conservative senator, Democrat from West Virginia, coal country, I don't think they're going to be able to rely on his vote. So they're going to need at least one more.
And do you think it's likely that they could get majority in the Senate after the election?
That's looking increasingly likely. That maybe a year ago, you would have said the Republicans had the advantage in the Senate in the sense that they have a 3-seat advantage and they just needed to retain those seats. And the Democrats, one of the Democratic seats, Doug Jones, was a Democrat elected in Alabama due to a fluke in that the Republicans nominated a pedophile, or at least an alleged pedophile, and who lost. So that's a seat that was sort of gifted to the Democrats. This time around, though, it's going to be much tougher for the Republicans. They have a good 6 to 8 seats that are all very under threat. And all the Democrats have to do is really win 4 of those, and they're likely to take a majority, maybe 5.
Thanks. And you also have great insights into Latin America. And for some of the countries, I wanted to touch on that too, just to step out of the US for a minute. Some of the countries like Argentina and Brazil, they responded very differently to COVID. Can you share some reflections on the different responses and, some likely political and other consequences of those responses?
Sure. Argentina, President Alberto Fernandez arguably launched one of the strictest quarantines outside of a dictatorship, and that Argentina is a democracy. People in Argentina are still at home. You can only leave your house in Argentina for very specific tasks, and you actually, if you get caught outside your home without proper paperwork, you can be fined and arrested. So it's been very severe. It's been pretty successful in that outside of some of the more marginal communities where you have lots of crowding and people are unable to social distance, Argentina has been able to avoid much of the tragedy in terms of deaths and infections that other countries have. But it's come at the cost of effectively destroying the Argentine economy, which is now essentially ceased, or at least is finding itself in a very difficult situation. Was already in bad situation with 50% inflation and needing to renegotiate its foreign debt. But now you've had effectively 3 months where there's been almost no economic growth or very limited economic growth. The government's been able to sort of patch things together by printing money and essentially forcing business owners to cover the cost of maintaining employees. But eventually we're going to start seeing hundreds, if not thousands, of bankruptcies of important companies across the country simply because the money's gone. Brazil's, sort of tale of two cities. Brazil, you have Jair Bolsonaro, who's a populist, more conservative, who's effectively rejected the idea of science and quarantines and doing anything really to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, he exacerbates often the situation by going out in public and demonstrating to people that they don't even need to wear masks. They don't need to worry about social distancing. As a result, we've seen Brazil's deaths just skyrocket. And really, deaths are the only statistic you can believe from Brazil these days because all the infection data, you have no idea about the coverage of that. And to the extent to which there's any effort by the Bolsonaro administration is to downplay the infections, even downplay some of the deaths, but those are tougher to hide. What we've seen is that the impact of Bolsonaro's policy has been widespread death throughout the country.
So quickly traveling to Mexico as well, and they opened up for international oil and gas companies in December 2013, and the optimism was very high at the time. And now, it seems to be difficulties in Mexico as well on several fronts. What's going on down there, both on the energy front and
well, yeah, they're sort of the opposite. Jair Bolsonaro is a conservative populist. The new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is a left-wing populist. What AMLO, which is how López Obrador is referred to, has done is effectively he's an energy nationalist, so he's always very skeptical of having foreign involvement in the energy sector. But what he's really doubled down on is effectively returning power to Pemex and local groups, and he's pretty much shut out any future investment. Thus far, at the edge, he's respecting contracts that have been signed under his predecessor, Enrique Peña Nieto. But even there, he's making it more and more difficult for foreign energy and oil and gas companies to do business. He isn't being successful with his economic approaches as the Mexican economy is cratering. But as a populist, he has a very short-term vision towards things. And so I think he's willing to let some of the negative effects occur for the energy sector if it means that he can sort of take the populist mantle of rescuing the oil and natural gas industry from foreign attacks. He's also one of those types of leftists that truly believes that if the foreign companies want to be involved, that's because they're taking advantage of Mexico, and therefore Mexico is going to always be better off by keeping things in a state-run nationalist type approach and avoiding too much foreign and natural gas activities. There still are some U.S. companies that are involved in some offshore activity in the Gulf of Mexico, but even they are sort of starting to wait and see and wonder if their investments actually will pay out in the future.
Thank you so much. You shared a lot of perspective, the consequences of COVID from, ranging from Argentina to, oil and gas specifics. You're giving us some predictions on the U.S. election, and we'll for sure follow it closely. Right. Unfortunately, we come at the point where we have to wrap up a really interesting conversation, but I wanted to ask if you had any final reflections or parting thoughts before we conclude.
Well, one thing we didn't discuss, but were implicitly assumed, is that the U.S. House will remain in Democratic hands. There's no doubts that Democrats are going to continue to control the House. So if Donald Trump is reelected, we will have divided government. The only question is, will Democrats be able to take the White House as well as the Senate to have unified government, and thus allow them to implement their policy agenda in an easier manner come 2021?
Thanks for sharing that. It sounds like U.S. politics will be some maneuvering either way, and I guess politics always should be.
Yeah,
yeah. Thank you so very much, and the best of luck. Stay safe, and thanks to all of you for watching the ONS Energy Talks.
Thank you.